Welcome back to Instant Book Club. I'm RJ Kerr, and today we're talking about part 2 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a tale of classic gothic horror, mystery, science fiction, and, well, human nature. So, let's dive in. What do I think of the plot? Well, it's pretty linear, pretty typical arc. Through the rising action, through climax, right down through our denouement. Very clean to map, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We follow this set of escalating anecdotes from the point of view of Mr. Utterson, all the way up through the climax when he has his final confrontation with Dr. Jekyll. And then at the resolution, we are summarily dumped into the point of view of first Dr. Lanyon and then Dr. Jekyll. And I gotta say, I'm not a fan of that device. We've been living in Utterson's skin throughout this whole story. Yes, it's told in the third person, and so we're not seeing the world as Utterson, but we're still seeing the world through Utterson because we're not given any other points of view until the last 2 chapters. And so we've been evaluating his whole experience using Utterson's emotional arc as our frame of reference, our calibration line by which the reader can decide their own feelings about Jekyll, and Mr. Hyde, and all the other characters in the story. And then we get to the end, when we finally have answers, and all of a sudden that reference line it's gone. We lose it entirely, and we're given these almost clinical accounts of the true events of what actually happened. But without Utterson's personal point of view, without his emotion to calibrate our own opinions, you feel very stranded at the end. Almost like you're not quite sure where to land. I think that Stevenson intended for us to pity Jekyll at the end of the story. I think that's why he dumped us into Jekyll as the very last character in the very last chapter. But to be honest, I find that difficult without Utterson making a case to pity his friend, without getting to feel what Utterson felt and use that to inform my own point of view, my own thoughts on the character. I find it difficult to sum it up much in the way of, well, pity for a man who gave himself over to his own darkness pretty readily. That might have been different, though, if we had gotten to experience those last 2 chapters as Utterson receiving the revelations in these letters, because surely he had opinions on them, surely he had feelings about them. I personally would have liked to have gotten those opinions, to have felt those feelings, if for no other reason than to better inform my own. So yes, I think the plot was pretty clean, typical sort of plot arc in terms of hitting all of the wickets, if you will. But I was dissatisfied at the end. So let's start by talking about our point of view character, Mr. Utterson. He has a stunted arc through this, and I think it's entirely due to the point of view shift. And I don't want to beat that dead horse, but he starts off with sort of this misbelief that the hearts of men are an open book. You really just have to sit down and read to understand. He's used to interacting with people that open up their inner worlds to him, as we see in the various sort of narrative summary moments when the narrator describes how typical it was for Utterson to stick around after a party ended, how people enjoyed sitting in his company and talking with him, who's non-judgmental, and his tendency to be acquainted with people even when they were in the lowest of their low, and hear their secrets. And so he starts with this belief that that he knows the people in his life. And then throughout the story, we see that misbelief start to unravel, specifically through his two best friends, or at least two oldest friends, Dr. Lanyon and Dr. Jekyll. He sees that there's something in both of these men below the surface. Predominantly in Dr. Jekyll, there's more hidden beneath the surface in Dr. Jekyll than Dr. Lanyon. But we start to see Utterson begin to realize that perhaps people aren't an open book. Unfortunately, though, we're denied the conclusion of that arc, because when we have that point of view shift, we don't get to see how the events of this narrative affect Utterson in the end. How does he change as a consequence of what he's now learned about the secret nature of people's inner lives? Does he become more guarded? Does he become more interested in rooting out the inner beliefs and understanding the inner worlds of the people around him? Does he become more reclusive? Does he become less friendly? More understanding, less understanding? We don't know. We don't know, because we never get to see how he responds, how he changes at the end of the story, which I think is disappointing. I would have liked to have seen his full emotional arc in this narrative. Now let's talk about Dr. Jekyll, who is our focal character as opposed to our point of view character, because he's who the story is really about. He's the emotional and the narrative arc that Stevenson really intends for us to follow, with Utterson's experience sort of paralleling Dr. Jekyll's in many places. Jekyll is, at least to me, I think a very unlikable character, very unlikable man in a lot of respects. He has this outward veneer of respectability, this sense of, I do the right thing when people are watching, but as soon as they're not, he's very willing to become Mr. Hyde, who is effectively all of Dr. Jekyll's negative traits boiled down into one entity. And Jekyll is very willing to view Mr. Hyde as a separate being, a totally different person making decisions outside of the choices that virtuous Dr. Jekyll would. And yet, Jekyll's very willing to ride shotgun inside Hyde and indulge in these same vices, these same evil acts. And while he feels guilt throughout the story, he regrets these things, he doesn't really ever repent for them. He does what's needed to do to avoid scandal, to brush these things under the rug, to leave effectively the mistakes of Hyde in the past. But he doesn't really seem to correct them in any way. And so you have a very self-absorbed character. A character who is perhaps trying to do what many people would like to do, separate the best of themselves from the worst of themselves. And yet, when he has that opportunity, he still revels in the worst of himself. And so we see a man with a misbelief that he can separate the wheat from the chaff, if you will. He can allow the cream to rise to the surface. He can be virtuous on one hand and dabble in vice on the other, and make a clear line distinction between the two. And yet, of course, we see throughout the story, as the plot unfolds, that that's not the case, that the part of him that he exercises is the part of himself that becomes dominant. And so I think this makes him a very interesting character to read, if perhaps not very likable, and to my mind not as pitiable as perhaps Stevenson intended. but still a dynamic character from a literary standpoint. Very enjoyable to read about, very enjoyable to dissect through the eyes of Mr. Utterson.
Let's take a quick break from our story to help you find your next great read. Thanks for listening, and now back to the story.
Let's talk about themes, because I think that the themes of the story are really where it comes into its own. Specifically, there are two themes that really jumped off the page at me that I want to talk about. The first is this idea of appearance versus true nature. Because throughout the story, we're introduced to people who have met Mr. Hyde and immediately dislike him. They don't know why, they just hate the man in a way they've never hated anyone else before. And so they keep looking for reasons to dislike him. Specifically, they keep looking for deformities, or they expect him to be deformed in some way. And Stevenson makes a point of noting that Hyde is not. He is not deformed, he's not misshapen, he's not externally evil in any capacity. He just looks like perhaps a blunt-featured regular person. And yet people really are resistant to believe this. They want there to be something external about him. Even Utterson, throughout the story, has this sense of the outside of people should reflect their inner nature. And yet we see multiple instances that that's just not the case. Stevenson, in fact, describes Dr. Jekyll as well-made. He's spoken of as though he's a handsome, gregarious, entertaining, engaging fellow, all the things that a good person should be, and yet he is very much rotted to the core because Mr. Hyde comes from him. And in fact, he shows very little remorse over the things that Mr. Hyde does. More guilt, well, maybe some remorse, but more guilt, not much repentance, I should say. I think that'd be the better way to phrase that. And yet, nobody expects him of this because they expect his outside to reflect his inside. And so I think that this is very aptly done by Stevenson in here, especially for the time period in which it was written. Nowadays, I think we do a better job culturally of taking the lesson that he's trying to teach here into account, although we're certainly not good at it yet, but better than they were when he originally wrote the story. That's for certain. And so I think he does an excellent job of using Hyde in particular to illustrate what can live inside a man, what can live inside a person that doesn't show itself on the surface. And then the second theme that he talks about that really caught me was the vices we exercise grow. Because, again, we see through Mr. Hyde, he's described initially as a very small man. And yet, as we encounter him more throughout the story, he gets bigger. In fact, Jekyll remarks on this at one point, that Hyde has grown. And it's a reflection of how often he's utilized by Jekyll. The more time Jekyll spends inside Hyde, well, the stronger Hyde gets. He's exercised, he's allowed to get out into the world and act. And so he becomes stronger and stronger and grows bigger and bigger. And eventually he overtakes Jekyll himself, becoming the dominant personality of the two. And so again, it's another subtle theme slipped in there by Stevenson, that this idea that we become the actions that we practice, that giving in to the worst parts of ourselves is not just a slip up, not just an indulgence, that if we do it and we do it again and again, each time we do it, that part of ourselves becomes stronger. And of course, the counterpoint that he suggests but doesn't illustrate here is that perhaps if Jekyll had exercised his virtuous side more than more than Mr. Hyde, well, perhaps the opposite would have been true of him. Perhaps the good part of Jekyll would have predominated the evil vileness of Mr. Hyde. It's a powerful notion. We are what we exercise. In terms of writing style, I think Robert Louis Stevenson in general has a more modern feel than a lot of the other public domain works that are out there. Now, so that's a lot of that is the time period in which these things were written. Public domain is what, 70 years before a title enters the public domain. And so there's necessarily a gap, a large gap of time between when the story's written and when it becomes freely accessible in something like Project Gutenberg. But still, other than some of the stiffness of some of the dialogue that's typical of sort of that more Victorian setting that he's writing in, I think it reads, in a sense, very, very modern, especially compared to some of the other things that we've read so far, specifically Poe and Lovecraft, who are so flowery that the purple prose is almost a fetish with them. It's almost like they look for the most overblown way of describing anything, which of course is, for Poe, was the style of the time. For Lovecraft, well, it's just Lovecraft. Howie, you beautiful creature. But Stevenson is a much cleaner rhetoric. His prose, there's an economy of prose in his work. I will say he's not as bare bones as somebody like Hemingway, but there's a cleanliness to how he writes that I think makes him a much easier read for the modern reader. Okay, let's talk pacing. I think this story is paced really well. It moves along at a good clip, and there's not a lot of fat in there in terms of unnecessary periods of inaction. Even when Utterson is thinking through his next steps, which is a necessary part of any story, his thought process moves at a rapid flow. It gets from point A to point B to point C very quickly, with very little time spent in between explaining what's happening or how he gets to a particular point. And it's easy to follow, and it's very quick. It keeps us in the action. In fact, there's that moment when Dr. Lanyon asks Utterson to stay around and talk about anything other than Jekyll to keep him company. And then the very next sentence of the story is Utterson back home. And so we get no hint of whether Utterson stayed and comforted his friend or just hit the bricks and came back home to focus on Jekyll, because we don't need it. And Stevenson leaves it out because of that. So the story really moves at a breathless pace. I will say that it works because this is a very action-heavy story, and it's not about suspense. There's very little room in a breathless story to build suspense like this. There's no negative space for the reader to sit and internalize what's going on. Now, this story, like a lot of action-based stories, flies by. And so we don't get any slow burn element here. And I have to say, I wonder how that would have changed the narrative. if there had been a little more negative space, a little more room to breathe in between the scenes, to think about what was happening, and to let the predicament of Hyde and Jekyll creep up on you. I don't know that that would have made it better, but it's interesting to think about. Okay, let's talk about point of view as an element of the story. For the majority of the story, we stick close to Mr. Utterson as our point of view character. Yes, our narrator is third person, but the narrator isn't omniscient. Everything that we see through Utterson. Even events that he wasn't present for are being told as they were retold to him. For example, when we're getting what the maid saw, when Mr. Hyde murdered Lord Carew, it's written in such a way as to suggest that this information has all been given to Utterson after the fact. Even in the text, it mentions, as the maid would later say, elements like that explaining that this is all stuff that Utterson has found out afterwards, found out through other people, but that he knows about. And yet, the resolution, as we mentioned, we get this shift out of his point of view into Dr. Lanyon, then into Dr. Jekyll, and I'm not about it. I have to say that this particular device is a pet peeve of mine. Don't get me wrong, I love multiple point of view stories, but if we're going to have multiple points of view, I want multiple points of view throughout. If we're going to just have one or two moments of a different point of view, then they damn well better be the prologue or the epilogue, because if they're anywhere else in the middle, I think they disrupt the narrative. If we've only been seeing the world through one person's eyes, why do we need to interject one additional person or two additional people in there for just a moment? Either give me everything through all three perspectives, or give me everything through one perspective. Stop this most of one, a little of two or three. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. It drives me insane. But I think it weakens the narrative. I think that it weakens the emotional arc, and I think it removes us from the skin of the person that we care about the most. Story. Okay, so overall, what do I think of the story? Well, I think that by and large, it's a classic for a reason. It's a strong narrative with a lot of great points, with an ending that falls a little flat. That blunted ending really dulls the blade of an otherwise very sharp story, but the character growth, the themes, in general, what it says about humanity and the nature of being human, I think is powerful and evocative, and is why the story has hung on for so long. So overall, I'd say 4 out of 5 stars. I'd recommend pretty much everybody give it a read. Well, there you have it. That's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Hope you enjoyed the story. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. And I hope you'll join me right back here next week when we read our first story from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. In the meantime, please like and subscribe to support the channel. I look forward to seeing you next Sunday.